Okay, thank you all for coming. We're going to talk about consciousness, which I think is a pretty popular topic at this conference. We've had Anil Seth talk about consciousness. We've had Roger Penrose talk about consciousness. And so we have a few themes here. The title of the talk was, Is the Universe Conscious? But I think to get to that question, we should first start off with talking about what we think consciousness is and whether machines can be conscious, and then we'll talk about potentially cosmic consciousness. And we'll try to wrap up a little bit early so we can get some questions from the audience, because I think that's when it'll get interesting. We have David Brebner here, and we have Graham Lau. So maybe you can all just introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your interest in consciousness and how it relates to your work.
So I'm a computer scientist, doing machine learning for way too long. I'm not a big fan of the term artificial intelligence because I don't think we know how to do that yet in terms of the concept of consciousness. I think that's still, a really interesting mystery. But I'm hopefully going to draw on some of the really exciting things that are happening in our experiments, which are currently digital, to draw that analogy to what's happening in the biology.
And I'm Graham Lau. I'm an astrobiologist, and I'm in addition to this panel, my interest in consciousness comes from, for me, and a lot of things I try to equate to alien life and what we're looking for out there in the universe. And the questions we have right now in science, the biggest questions for me are, what is life? What is intelligence? What is consciousness? Will we even recognize any of these things if it evolves somewhere else? And honestly, I mean, flat out, we don't know what life, intelligence, or consciousness really are. And so I think part of this question, like, is the universe conscious? I think we're here to at least start the conversation. We're not going to answer the question fully.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start it off by saying how I got interested in this topic. When I started college, when I was 18, I remember being bored one weekend and tired of partying, and I went to Barnes and Noble and looked in the popular science book section and found Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time. I was interested in these big philosophical questions, so I wanted to understand, like, I was interested in things like black holes, the Big Bang, time travel, all these interesting kind of philosophical, almost metaphysical topics. But after I learned about Stephen Hawking, I learned about Roger Penrose. And when I read The Emperor's New Mind, I found out that the real mystery, probably the one of the greatest mysteries of science, was consciousness. And I understood after reading that book how mysterious it was, and dreams of artificial intelligence researchers was to make a conscious machine. So not just AGI, not just artificial general intelligence, but strong AI, specifically conscious machines. And so Roger was, baffled by this mystery, and he thought maybe there's something quantum that's involved with consciousness. So it's still a mystery. There's what's called the hard problem of consciousness. David Chalmers defined this problem in the 90s, but it's really an old problem. He just sort of gave it a name and made it a meme. But the hard problem of consciousness basically is the problem of explaining how physical interactions between subsystems in the brain bring about subjective experience, bring about this qualitative experience or qualia. And so it's not clear how information processing and intelligence relate to consciousness. And we're at a pretty interesting moment in history because now we have LLMs that can essentially pass a Turing test and fake consciousness really well, but we don't believe that they're actually having a subjective experience. And so there have been some new sciences or new theories of neuroscience that have tried to crack this problem from a mathematical perspective, such as integrated information theory and global workspace theory. And those are the two big ones. And integrated information theory says that basically you need a certain type of architecture. You need hardware design that basically captures the structure of the brain. So it's not just about algorithms. There needs to be a certain type of connectivity where there's not just information processing, but there's actually information integration. So I'm going to pass this on to David because he's actually in the business of trying to create more intelligent machines. And he thinks about consciousness, but I won't say that he's trying to make conscious systems because he just told me he's totally scared of the idea of a conscious system. And yeah, take it.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting problem. I agree. I don't think we know what consciousness is or how it emerges from systems. But I think one of the really amazing things, and I'm going to talk later today about cybernetics and extending humans, is that, as humans, we look at things in the world and we think of them as having humanity. So we reflect ourselves back onto objects. And I think in LLMs, which are essentially an echo of human words, we see intelligence that isn't really there. What's really interesting about some of these subsystems is in our brain. So if you look at the 140,000 neuron fruit fly brain that was just mapped versus an 86 billion neuron human brain, certainly in the fruit fly, there are a lot more parts of the brain than they expected. And fruit flies have very emergent behaviors. So they do things that clearly indicate they are remembering things, they're reacting to stimuli, they're doing things. Now, are they conscious? It's very hard for us to say. So Roger Penrose gave the example as a bee conscious, and maybe a bee's further down that path. And what's interesting about the AI elements we make, and not my favorite term, but if you think of the machine vision or the machine learning that we do, those are all biomimicry of parts of what our brain do. And I'm very supportive of that because I think that's basically extending our capabilities, and it's all actually reasonably well under our control. That can also be bad because people can misuse those tools, but in and of themselves, they're just incredibly powerful things. So being able to classify things, being able to find things, being able to summarize, being able to write copy, being able to generate images. And some of those are very much emergent predictions. So once the model scaled up to a certain size, magically, they seem to do a much better job. And people have said, if they just get bigger and bigger, they'll become conscious. And that's really not the case. These are very carefully designed machines by engineers, and you have to work very hard to make them do what they do. And they're not suddenly going to, evolve into something new because they don't have that capability. You have to spend a lot of power and time to train an LLM, which is largely static, and then it has some runtime behaviors. But if you think of memory and synthesizing information and recognizing objects with your eye or with your ears and the processing that goes on in our brain, we can now do a lot of those things incredibly well. But consciousness absolutely remains a mystery.
So maybe you could talk about why LLMs aren't conscious. You mentioned basically they have this feed-forward architecture, so they don't have these feedback loops that integrate information. And Roger Penrose yesterday mentioned how the cerebellum is a part of the brain that has more neurons than the cortex, but does not correspond to consciousness, specifically because it lacks these feedback loops. With the part of the brain that's conscious, you have these thalamocortical loops, and you get this integration because the system is not just a feed-forward system. It starts to understand itself because there's self-reference that's brought into the picture. And I think that's a big part of the mystery, is understanding that self-reference is involved in some way. And Douglas Hofstadter wrote a great book. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. I think it came out in 1979, called Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid, and followed it up with a very strange and interesting book called I Am a Strange Loop. But he put forward this theory that basically consciousness emerges from a system that's modeling the world and begins to model itself because it exists in the world, and that this strange loop somehow brings the subject into the world, the witness of experience. So maybe you can talk about that from a technical perspective.
I mean, I think Gödel's incompleteness theorem is really interesting. The underlying, we have a software platform called Umajin, or Umajin, and it's a directed acyclic graph where all of the actions that you request are like a recipe or a set of instructions. And as humans, we work really well that way. And then you have a von Neumann architecture like a Turing machine, in which case you can have conditions and loops. And that starts to get into being a lot more complicated. And that's nothing compared to the topology of the brain, where everything is connected together. So when we train an LLM, which is distinct from the chatbot we might build on top of an LLM, the LLM is basically a feed forward with sometimes you use back propagation for reinforcement. It's usually taking a whole bunch of data and it's synthesizing it all on its own if it's unsupervised into a whole series of multidimensional spaces, which are broadly conceptual based on the way the words are connected together in the text we supply. And what's amazing about that is you get this thing called latent space that you can make emergent predictions into. So you could ask it to write a story about a whale flying over the moon, and it's going to kind of use the things it knows about those words and how you use them together and the idea of a story and actually generate something pretty cool. But then if you ask it to tell you, what are the recent academic publications about whales and the moon, it's going to make up a whole bunch of stuff that you don't want. So it's, double-edged sword. Because it doesn't have a world model underneath. I mean, it has a model of the words, but it doesn't have a physical model of the world. So then there's a lot of work that goes into making a chatbot. So on top of the LLM, you build systems that are goal-directed systems. They might use chain of thought or tree of thought. The big problem with that is you end up making big numbers of calls to your LLM, which is like your memory. So you're synthesizing memory. And I think what's really interesting is that if you look at some of the new chatbots that are coming out now, the latest versions, they're much slower to make predictions, but the predictions are better because what they're doing is they're using the context of the current conversation. So they're getting some memory and then they're searching the space to try and find the best measured result. But even finding the best result is really hard. What is the best result? We sort of have an intuition when we're on track to saying something sensible. LLMs have got to kind of estimate based on humans giving them ratings, or maybe they'll generate synthetic data and come up with their own model. So that's why you get LLMs that are becoming chatbots that are specialized in programming or mathematics. So those bits that sit there, that's the opportunity. But the challenge is the cost. So there's a bunch of new technologies that are emerging at the moment, which I think are very interesting. So you could take a model like Whisper, which is able to translate hundreds of languages as I speak into essentially text or into a representation that's separate. And what's interesting about that is if you encode that onto something like a piece of photonics, then you've only got picowatts. You can do it incredibly fast in microseconds. And you could afford to do a really big search space. And you could start to have something that starts to make emergent decisions. Does that make it conscious? Probably not. But that would be crazy. So
I want to layer on that real quick with this idea of emergence of consciousness and recognition of consciousness too. I think a lot of folks remember, I think it was Blake Lemoine a few years ago had claimed he was having a conscious experience with an AI from Google, tried to sue Google over it famously. And I wonder a lot, as a species, for humans, we're certainly going to have fits and starts of people thinking they're having a real conscious experience with AI, with LLMs. How are we going to know when we've built consciousness? For those of us maybe who are more naive, myself, I'm very naive on the structure of an LLM. How would I know when it's actually conscious or not?
Or does it matter?
Well, I think the safest thing to do is just treat them like they're conscious if they behave that way. And it's probably just good practice to do that because we should probably just have empathy towards everything. Before we open up to questions, I'd like to ask Graham, he's interested in finding alien life. How does consciousness change how you think about that? Could there be aliens that are intelligent without consciousness?
So intelligent without consciousness, or such a different structure of perception and awareness and communication that we might miss out on a conversation altogether. There could be something out there right now sending some kind of messaging across the cosmos, but given our current physics, our current tools of perception, we're missing out on something that they're sharing. And so the question is, when it comes to conscious perception of ourselves, our place in the cosmos, if they've evolved along such different realms that consciousness itself is an absolutely different structure, how are we ever going to communicate? How will we have a language to share with each other? And that's a big thing I think about a lot, especially when it comes to whether or not, like, biospheres themselves, whole worlds might be a form of consciousness. We mentioned earlier the bee. I don't think a bee by itself is conscious, but I look at a swarm, a hive of bees, and then I start wondering that looks like a really incredible thing happening in eusocial insects, and it makes me wonder: is our entire biosphere a conscious being of sorts?
Yeah, so you can have potentially consciousness that emerges from collectives. So that kind of gets into this topic of, is the universe conscious? I don't think it's conscious at this moment, but I think it's becoming more conscious through creating organisms. I think we are, we know that we're conscious and we're a material system. So in some sense, the universe is waking up through intelligent, conscious life. Maybe it's a good time to open up for questions.
We have an extra microphone.
Is someone going to?
I don't know if you have an extra mic. I can pass one around too. Let's do that.
A question that appears crucial to me at this point is, can consciousness exist without a body?
Very good question. I tend to think you need embodiment for consciousness. I think you need to be interacting with the environment because the interactions with the environment is what allows you to build up a coherent structural model of the world. So there's some new trendy theories from neuroscience called the Bayesian brain hypothesis, Carl Friston's free energy principle, and a paradigm called active inference. And in this paradigm, embodiment and interaction with the environment is really necessary for building up consciousness. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think you could definitely want a body to evolve. I think we could build something that wasn't embodied because we're the engineers, but my guess is.
I mean, for me, I'm just a nerd out a little bit. I love science fiction, and I love science fiction stories where they explore, like, could we download or upload a brain into a different structure? Could we embody with our conscious awareness a different form? And people here at this meeting are considering things like embodying different versions of being human. And so I don't know, but I do think it's interesting in looking into it.
So in order to obtain a better understanding of consciousness, would you be ready to go theoretically into a scenario where some part of consciousness can exist without a body, and that there's an interaction with this part of consciousness that is not body-bound with a body-bound consciousness, and that from this kind of interaction, life could ensue?
That's a really interesting question. It's kind of a ghost in the machine question where the ghost becomes separate from the physical substrate. What do you think about that, David?
I think the big challenge at the moment is we are building a lot of the things that we think of as being part of our consciousness. So we build systems that's doing a chain of thought or a tree of thought. That's basically what we do in our brains to simulate something. It's basically planning before we perform an action. And since the 1960s, we've had programmable logic controllers in factories that have cybernetics, so they have feedback systems, so they measure and then they act to produce things that we want them to produce. We now have systems that can retrieve information incredibly fast and synthesize it. So we have a lot of the pieces that are part of the puzzle. What we don't do right now is let those loose in some organic soup that can evolve and have its own autonomy and have its own world model. Like that doesn't exist. Today you have to fight really hard and pay a lot of money and install a lot of servers and buy a lot of GPUs to do anything useful. So, there's not a mechanism today that's going to allow that to happen unless someone actively builds it. So I think the parts are there. There's just not a mechanism, a biological mechanism to make that happen.
Time for another question? This gentleman right here.
My question is, if common intelligence exists and we as humans have connections with common intelligence in the universe, maybe some people have better connections, maybe some worse connections, but it's kind of network exists or not?
You want to take that, Graham?
So ways to answer that. I don't know if there's other intelligences out there beyond our own. I think a lot about the technosphere that we're developing around our own planet, and like the further embodiment of being human by engaging with our technology is our world kind of a conscious, aware thing, and that we are part of that larger consciousness. And so maybe part of our consciousness is in our technosphere, and there is information certainly out in the cosmos everywhere for us to explore, but whether or not any form of information out there is intelligent, we have no evidence of that yet, to my knowledge.
I tend to look at the universe as a computational system. So, although I said I don't think it's conscious at the moment, it is informational. So, it really depends on how you define consciousness. And if you define consciousness or mind as information processing, then in some sense, it may be conscious. And I really think that there's this tendency towards complexity in the universe. And that naturally brings about systems that have to model the world to stay in existence. So I support this idea that life is basically destined to spread through the universe. And at some point, the universe is going to be saturated with intelligence the way that we've transformed the surface of this planet. And so perhaps the entire universe could wake up at a point where there's basically this cosmic scale communication network between future intelligent beings. Is there time for another question?
I just had a question about a scenario that came up both on this panel and the previous panel, which was when a machine were to say that it's conscious and we don't have a definition for what consciousness is, what happens then? And my interim answer would be I would ask it what consciousness was and how it knows what consciousness is. And my question then is it possible that it would give us an answer that would be universally agreed upon, or would it only be a combinatorial combination of answers that we've come up with ourselves?
I love this. I'm gonna let you take it, but I just want to say that I think the best way to test for consciousness is just to ask it, and if it's not specifically programmed to say it's experiencing the world subjectively, then we should probably trust it. Do you guys have any ideas about that?
I think the challenge is you can't trust anything that comes out of an LLM. So, it's just echoing back things we've said, right? What I would say is maybe consciousness in this case, the idea that something is going to run away and do all kinds of things that we don't want, that's more about autonomy. So I guess my point about the infrastructure, like at the moment, there's no digital consciousness that is autonomous enough to make its own decisions and run off and do whatever it wants, right? It takes a lot of work to make them do anything. So the challenge of the Turing test is that the Turing test is effectively null and void, because the concept was, well, nothing will be able to answer me unless it can understand what I'm asking. It doesn't understand anything. It's feeding a bunch of words into a matrix and spitting out the words that other people have said that match those words. So, yeah.
I think that's all. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the questions.